Welcome to the first of this 3-night study on the book of the prophet Zephaniah. And we're going to find over the course of these 3 nights that this is a very interesting and it's a very dynamic prophecy. And it was given in the days of Josiah and it's contemporary with the prophet Jeremiah. And it's a message that begins in chapter 1 with a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem and captivity of the nation of Judah. Chapter 2 then begins with this stern and urgent warning to anyone who would listen to God's message. And it ends with God's judgments upon the Gentile nations that surround Judah. And chapter 3 concludes with a prophecy that concludes the prophecy firstly with a vindication of Yahweh's just judgments, the hope of the nation being restored, and a time even beyond that, a time beyond even our day when the kingdom of God would be established on this earth and all the nations of the earth would turn to praise God in worship. And that's what makes this prophecy so relevant to us today. And we're going to see this time and time again that contained within here are so many lessons for us, and we've got the key to our salvation, and we've got this wonderful vision of the future. And so it's a powerful prophecy, and it's only 3 chapters long, but even still it's jam-packed full of all relevant prophecy. Many of the prophecies which we'll see have already come to pass and others which are still to come. And that's why we've used the overall theme of the great day of Yahweh is near. Because it is near, brethren and sisters. And just like the day of Yahweh was coming in the days of Zephaniah, so too is there a day of Yahweh coming in the future for us. And so chapter 1 is full of warnings about this great day of Yahweh. And as we're going to see, these warnings were largely ignored by the people. Does this sound familiar to our day today? It sounds exactly like what we're experiencing in our day. The Bible is full of warnings about this future day of Yahweh for us, and yet the world at large is generally ignorant of them. Well, the Yahweh's day of judgment is coming to the world, and the Apostle Peter tells us that it starts at the household of God, which is why today's study is on the household of God, on the people of Judah. And that's what we're going to see in this prophecy. It's the need for the people of God to be careful and not to become complacent, exactly like the people were in the day of Zephaniah. So what do we know about Zephaniah? I think there's 3 things that we know about him that we can gather from this record. We know his name, we know his genealogy, and we know the time period in which he prophesied. So let's just have a look at each of these in a little bit of detail. Firstly, starting with his name. Actually, Zephaniah doesn't even start with a Z in the Hebrew. It starts with a TS. So it would be Zephaniah. And Zephaniah's name means Yahweh hath hidden, which is completely appropriate when we start to get into the detail of this prophecy. You see, this theme of being hidden runs throughout the whole of the prophecy of Zephaniah. And so we might ask ourselves the question, well, what has God hidden? And we're going to see that there's actually 3 aspects of this theme of Yahweh has hidden and of being hidden in this book. And when we combine them all together, we end up seeing the spiritual state of the nation in the days of Zephaniah. Well, the first of these 3 aspects of this idea of being hidden is about God himself. And it's clear from Zephaniah and other of the contemporary prophets that Yahweh had hidden his face from the people. In fact, it was Moses that prophesied about this. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 32 very quickly, because all the way back here we have Moses prophesying on this very topic. Deuteronomy chapter 32, it's a prophetic song of Moses. And his singing in this song of the faithfulness of God, and his singing of the faithlessness of the nation. His singing about their chastisement and the need for this infliction by God, and is singing about the compassion that God has on this lowly state of the nation of Israel. And we read in verse 15, "But Jeshurun," that is Israel, "but Israel waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxen fat, thou art become thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation." So this verse is speaking about Israel. Moses knew exactly what would become of the people. He knew that they would wax fat and that they would forsake God. And what's the end result? Well, he goes on in verse 20 to say, this is God speaking now, "I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are a very froward generation, children in whom is no faith." And the word hide there is the Hebrew word sathar. I will hide my face from them. And we're going to see that same word in Zephaniah. And so all the way back here in Deuteronomy 32, Moses is giving this prophetic song about a day in the future when Yahweh would hide his face from the people. And so many years later, we come to a time when this prophecy is being seen in the nation. Just have a look at what some of the other prophets are saying about the people and about this time period. These are roughly contemporary. So Isaiah perhaps prophesied 60 to 100 years earlier than Zephaniah. And he said, concerning God, God says, "In a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord thy Redeemer." So Yahweh is speaking about this time when he would hide his face, or he had hidden his face from the people. And then you have Ezekiel, who came after Zephaniah, and he says in Ezekiel 39 and verse 23, again, God says, "The heathen shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they trespassed against me. Therefore hid I my face from them, and gave them into the hand of their enemies. So fell they all by the sword." Well, the second aspect of this theme of being hidden relates also to the attitude of the people. You see, the people were generally doing whatever they pleased, and they thought that all of their wickedness would just be hidden from Yahweh, that he wouldn't see it, or that he didn't really care and he wasn't really watching them anyway. And you get that sense from these records here. So from Jeremiah 16 and verse 17, and God says, "For mine eyes are upon their ways. They are not hid from my face, neither is their iniquity hid from mine eyes." See, the people thought that their wickedness would be hid from God. And again, Jeremiah 23 and verse 24, "Can any hide himself in secret places that I shall not see him, saith Yahweh? Do not I fill heaven and earth, saith Yahweh?" So you start to get this understanding of the situation that existed at the time. They thought that they could hide their wickedness from God. However, God was right there, and he was saying, "You can't hide anything from me. And in fact, because of your attitude, I've hidden my face from you." And the third aspect of this theme of being hidden is found in Zephaniah 2 and verse 3, and we're going to deal with that in a little bit more detail in our next class. But just briefly, we read in Zephaniah 2 and verse 3, "Seek ye Yahweh, all ye meek of the earth, which have wrought his judgment. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be ye shall be hid in the day of Yahweh's anger." And here's that Hebrew word sathar again. It may be ye shall be hid. Yes, the people thought that their wickedness was hid from God. Yes, God had actually hidden his face from the people. But equally so, we find that those that seek God, those that are meek, those that seek righteousness, those that are seeking after meekness, they're very much still in the mind of God. He would protect them and he would hide them from the judgment to come. You get this sentiment picked up by the psalmist in Psalm 27 and verse 5. "For in the time of trouble he will hide me in his pavilion." And also Psalm 17 and verse 8. "Keep me as the apple of the eye, hide me under the shadow of thy wings." And here we have the psalmist talking about this idea of being hidden of Yahweh and being protected by him. And so the name of Zephaniah really reveals to us three messages that are contained throughout this book. Firstly, that Yahweh has hidden his face from the people, and a time of judgment would come when they would be destroyed. Another warning that the people can't hide themselves from Yahweh. He sees and knows everything. And as we'll see from this first chapter, that he would search them out with candles. But of course, there's the exhortation as well, that Yahweh remembers those that are faithful and will hide them from the coming destruction. And what's absolutely amazing and completely undeniable is how all these three factors are equally applicable today. The face of God is hid from the world. The world thinks that it can hide itself and all of its wickedness from God. And yet, each one of us have the opportunity to be among those who Yahweh will hide when the judgments come upon the earth. Well, we mentioned another piece of information that we know about Zephaniah relates to his genealogy. And when we come back to Zephaniah 1 and verse 1, we read, "The word of Yahweh came unto Zephaniah, the son of Cushai, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah." You know, it's very unusual for a prophet to mention so many generations in a lineage. If you were to have a look at Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Jonah, they only mention one generation, and that's the father of the prophet. Some of the prophets, like Amos and Obadiah and Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Haggai, they don't even mention any genealogy at all. Zechariah is the only one that really goes any further. That goes down to 2 generations. But here we have Zephaniah going down 4 generations. So it means there must be something relevant for us to consider in that. And I think what we find when we look at the names and the meaning of those names is quite an interesting message that again relates to the time period in which this prophecy existed. So we know Zephaniah means Yahweh is hidden, and Cushai means black, and Gedaliah means Yah is great, and Amariah means Yahweh has spoken, and Hezekiah, which is a variation of Hezekiah, means Yahweh is strength. And when we put all of these names together and we go from father to son, we get this idea that Yahweh is strength, he has spoken, he is great, but blackness has come to the people because Yahweh has hidden his face from them. And doesn't that sound also exactly like our day today? Yahweh is strength. Yahweh has spoken. Yahweh is great, but there's a blackness and a darkness in the world because they've rejected Yahweh and he has hidden his face from them. It is suggested by several commentators that the name Hezekiah here could be King Hezekiah, and that perhaps there is some relationship that isn't revealed in the Bible. But whatever it is, Zephaniah is telling us that he has a generation that spans all the way back through the evil years of Manasseh and Ammon. And that's really the third thing that we know about Zephaniah. It's the time period in which he prophesied. And we saw from verse 1 that he prophesied in the time period of Josiah, and that would put him at around about 640 to 610 BC. And Scripture paints a very detailed picture of what it was like around this time. Judah was in a bad way. Judah was steeped in idolatry. They were totally insensitive to the things of the truth. And that it had been that way for nearly 60 years under the reign of King Manasseh and Ammon. And along comes little Josiah, age 8, and he steps onto the throne. And through this period, we can't emphasize enough just how terrible things had gotten under the leadership of Manasseh. It was so bad in the reign of Manasseh that it was at that point in time that Yahweh had determined to end the kingdom of Judah. He knew from that point that there was no way they could change. And Ammon was no better than his father Manasseh. And to see the context of this time period, just to look at a couple of points, come over to 2 Kings chapter 22. 2 Kings 22, of course, we have in verse 2, we're told that Josiah did that which was right in the sight of Yahweh. And in verse 3, we come to the 18th year of King Josiah. And in verse 3, Josiah has sent Shaphan to Hilkiah, the high priest, and has sent him to go and sum up the silver which had been donated to the house of Yahweh. He wants to use this to repair the house of Yahweh. And so in verse 8, Hilkiah is talking to Shaphan, and he says, I found a book of the law in the house of Yahweh. And Hilkiah gives the book to Shaphan, and Shaphan reads the book. You may remember that during the time period of Manasseh, Manasseh took a concerted effort to try to destroy every single Bible. He wanted to get rid of them all. And he probably almost succeeded, except for this one Bible that had been found in the rubble of the temple, the book of the law. And Shaphan reads this book of the law, and he immediately tucks it under his arm, and he runs over to Josiah, and he goes to Josiah, and he starts reading this book of the law to Josiah. This is the first time this law has been read for so many years. And you can imagine as Shaphan is reading this book, that Josiah is becoming more and more concerned about the state of the nation. And Josiah, as this book is being read, he would have thought to himself, look at all the things that we aren't doing. We haven't offered the appropriate sacrifices to God. We haven't followed the law of God. Look at the consequences. What have we done? And as this realization starts to hit home, in a state of despair, Josiah rips his clothes and he weeps. And he's weeping for the sins of his forefathers and is weeping for the sins of the nation. And straight away, Josiah appoints this delegation in verse 13. He wants them to go and find someone who could consult with Yahweh and find out more about this. And so this delegation goes to Huldah the prophetess. And the word of Yahweh comes back through the prophetess. And these are the words that Yahweh says in verses 16 and 17 of 2 Kings 22. Behold, I will bring evil upon this place and upon the inhabitants thereof, even all the words of the book which the king of Judah hath read, because they have forsaken me and have burned incense unto other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath shall be kindled against this place and shall not be quenched. So the nation was under a divine, irrevocable sentence of judgment. Nothing could be done to change the judgment, at least not at a national level. It was absolutely hopeless for them. There was no way that the entire nation could be converted back to God. However, the mercy of God was still available to the faithful. And you have that come out in verse 20. This is what God says concerning Josiah. Behold, therefore, I will gather thee unto the fathers, and thou shalt be gathered into the grave in peace, and thine eyes shall not see all the evil which I will bring upon this place. And they brought the king word again. So the individual could still respond and be saved. Josiah here was promised in verse 20 that he wouldn't see the evil that was to come, that he would be sleeping with his fathers. And that's exactly what happened. Josiah died at the age of 39. And in 30 years after that, the nation was gone. And so the impending judgment was a foregone conclusion. However, this didn't stop Josiah from instituting the greatest religious reformation of any of the kings of Israel. And we know that the Reformation commenced in his 12th year as king. And these reformations, they were an amazing work, but they never really truly turned the people's hearts back to God. It was really only a superficial response from the nation. And it's into that state of the nation that Jeremiah and Zephaniah are prophesying. Jeremiah prophesied from the 13th year of Josiah, when Josiah was 21, so about a year after the reformations had begun. And Zephaniah would have prophesied around the same time. And things were bad in Judah. You know, things were so bad that in Jeremiah 5 and verse 1, this is what God says to Jeremiah. He says, "Run to and throw throughout the streets of Jerusalem. Look and take note. Search her squares and see if you can find a man, one, who does justice and seeks truth, that I might pardon her." How awful is that? This was during the time of the Reformation. Find me just one faithful man out there in the streets, and I will forgive all of Jerusalem. You know, when the angel of God was speaking to Abraham regarding the destruction of Sodom, it got down to 10 people. Find me 10 faithful people in Sodom, and I won't destroy it. Well, here God's saying, find me just one man in the streets. You see, God could see the people. He could see into their hearts. And he told Jeremiah in chapter 3 and verse 10 that even with this great religious reformation, that the nation of Judah hadn't turned to God with her whole heart, but rather they'd done so deceptively. It was only pretend. It was only falsehood. And while they were packing the ecclesial halls, and they were claiming in chapter 7 of Jeremiah that they were the temple of Yahweh, yet God was telling them that they were hypocrites. And unfortunately, the influence of Manasseh on the people was so long-lasting that even these reformations of Josiah, even the prophecies of Jeremiah and the prophecies of Zephaniah weren't enough to change the hearts of the people or to alter the future course of events. But what they could do is they could save individuals. And so the voice of God comes to Zephaniah as Yahweh's judgments are decreed. And he says to him in verses 1 and 2 of Zephaniah, in verses 2 and 3, "I will utterly consume all things from off the land, saith Yahweh. I will consume man and beast. I will consume the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, and the stumbling blocks with the wicked, and I will cut off man from off the land, saith Yahweh." The word consume here is the Hebrew word suf, and it means to snatch away or to completely terminate. And that is what God was going to do to all of those who wanted to have nothing to do with him. And when we see the immorality that fills the earth today, it's not really much different to what we read about the days of Manasseh. And we're going to keep seeing this over and over again, how closely aligned some of these things are with our day. Well, Zephaniah 1 and verses 2 and 3 is really an allusion back to Genesis 6. Genesis chapter 6, the flood chapter. Listen to the words of Genesis 6 and verse 7, "Spoken by God because of the wickedness of man, which was great on the earth." He says in verse 7, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air." And so it's the same language and it's the same order used here by Zephaniah. In other words, Yahweh is taking our minds and the minds of the people back to the very beginning. It's a reminder that the coming judgment isn't without some precedent. Remember Noah, God is saying in this prophecy. Remember how the whole earth was filled with wickedness? I told them that I would destroy man and beast and fowl and fish. And it happened just as I said. Man, beast, fowl and fish were destroyed by the flood. The flood was inevitable. There was no way they could stop it, just like there was no way that they could stop the judgment of the nation. And in verse 3, Zephaniah also says that God would consume the stumbling blocks with the wicked and cut off man from off the land. And if you've got your wide margin Bible, you'll find that the word stumbling block is the Hebrew word which means idols. And what do we think of when we think of idols? Well, we think of the obvious one, which is when the children of Israel created the golden calf and worshipped it instead of God. But really, an idol, then, is anything that can take our minds and our imaginations away from God. And in Genesis 6 and verse 5, it says that God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. And so the imagination had lost focus on God. It idolized every evil thing. It had created these idols that had taken the people away from God. And for this reason, they're described as being evil continually. And you'd describe the world like that today as well, wouldn't you? The world today has put in every single possible stumbling block and idol that will take away their imaginations from God and take away that pure worship. The Apostle John warns us about this in 1 John 5 and verse 21. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. And so, having opened the prophecy by drawing our minds back to the destruction that came with the flood, Zephaniah now starts to pinpoint exactly who these judgments were against and the reason why these judgments were coming. And God turns his attention to Judah and Jerusalem. And the first issue that he's going to focus on in verse 4 are the remnant of Baal, that he would cut off the remnant of Baal. You know, Baal was an idol. It was an ancient Canaanite and Mesopotamian deity associated with agriculture. And he was believed to be the giver of life because mankind was dependent on him providing all of the necessary things that were required to sustain the farms and the flocks and the herbs, and so ultimately life. So the people were praising this idol of Baal as being the giver of life. They weren't looking to Yahweh and saying Yahweh is the giver of life. They were looking at this idol. And Yahweh said that he would cut off the remnant, and that word remnant there means name. And Yahweh was going to remove the very name of Baal. It was going to become a byword, something that was in the past. Completely get rid of Baal and the name of Baal throughout the nation. Well, the next thing that is mentioned are the chemarims in verse 4. The word chemarims means the black-robed priests, and it's the same word used in 2 Kings 23 as part of the Reformation that Josiah put in place. And Josiah put down the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places of the city of Judah. And so what it seems is that in the days of Manasseh, that these different priests, this different priesthood had been set up. These chemarim. And this was in addition and different to the Levitical priesthood. The word priests that's in 2 Kings 23 is this Hebrew word chemarim. And Strong says that the word means an ascetic, as if they're shrunk from self. They're self-macerating. It gives a sense of someone who does harm to themselves. And this was their form of atonement. They'd introduced this harm to themselves so that they could have a clear conscience. And the root idea of this word chemarims means to shrivel up, to be deeply affected by passion. It's like someone who is so deeply affected by passion that they don't eat and therefore they just shrivel up. And these black-robed priests would have led the people in all sorts of pagan rites. And they would have got so worked up, and they were so full of passion about these pagan rites that they just withered up. Well, verse 4 also mentions the priests, and that's a different Hebrew word. That's the Hebrew word Cohen. And the word Cohen is applied to a variety of different priests, but it also includes the Levitical and Aaronic priests. These people were supposed to be the Christadelphians of the day. And it's quite likely, given they're mentioned here, that they had aligned themselves to the Chemarims. What a terrible thing to imagine. And it's really a warning to us today about aligning ourselves with false religion. This was in the house of God. These priests, these Chemarims, were leading the worship. And in verse 5, the next group that are mentioned are those that worship the host of heaven upon the housetops. So this group of people were worshipping the stars instead of Yahweh. And you'll recall that in the nation, the houses were built with a flat rooftop so that people could go up onto the rooftop and they could pray to God. But these people had turned to the stars and astrology and the zodiac signs to guide them. You know, they'd look at the zodiac signs and see what to expect in the future. And they did this at night. And so during the day, this group of people were down in the temple and they were singing, "The temple of Yahweh are we, the temple of Yahweh are we." But at night time, they're up on the rooftop, worshipping the stars. The next group of people that are mentioned are those that swear by Yahweh and that swear by Malcolm, or Molech, as it should be rendered. This group of people had a divided allegiance. And who was Molech? Well, Molech was the god of the Ammonites, and the Phoenicians. And this was the god that was set up, that some Israelites went and sacrificed their infants to in the valley of Hinnom. And so out of one side of their mouth, they're praising Yahweh. And they're giving him lip service. And out of the other side, they're praising and they're serving Molech. You know, on the surface, these people might have appeared to be good Christadelphians. But remember the words of Jesus in Matthew 6 and verse 24. "No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon." And this is something we need to be mindful of today. We can't have one foot in the truth and then have the other foot in the world. The next group of people that are mentioned are the backsliders. The word turn back here is the Hebrew word to flinch, or to go back, or to retreat. And it's rendered as backslider in Proverbs 14 and verse 14. This person used to serve God, but not anymore. This person has gone back into the world. You know, this is very similar to the parable of the sower. You've got the seed that fell on the stony ground, and the trials and the tribulations pop up and they are offended and they turn their back on God. And then you've got the thorny ground where the cares and the riches of the world choke them and they become unfruitful and unfaithful. Again, we need to be mindful that in our lives there are these stones and these thorns that are attempting to pull us away from the truth. We need to be mindful and keep the faith and not turn our backs on God and on the truth. And then we have those who have not sought Yahweh or inquired of him in verse 6. The word sought is bakash, and it means to search out or to strive after. And the word inquired is darash, which means to seek diligently. So this is the group of people that believed in God, but they'd really slipped into a Laodicean spirit. They hadn't been seeking Yahweh. They weren't seeking him out diligently. This was the believer that had the Bible on the bookshelf, that just collected dust, desperate to be read. But they really were only a superficial believer and didn't really seek out God diligently. They hadn't developed that personal relationship with God. We know the words of Hebrews 11 and verse 6. "For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." And there's that idea of diligently seeking. And if you're going to come to God, it's not going to happen if you simply become a Christadelphian and then become complacent and inactive. We've got to be a person who diligently seeks God. And we do this by reading the Bible, by praying to God, by praising him in song, by listening to the meetings, by studying the Word, and by having every aspect of our lives permeating with the truth. And so what we find in these few verses of Zephaniah is that God is pointing the finger to these different groups of people. He's pointing at the idolaters. He's pointing at those priests that had a false religion. He's pointing at those priests that had aligned with these false religious priests. He points at those who were worshipping the stars, those who were worshipping mammon as well, those who had turned their back on God, those who weren't diligently seeking Yahweh. He points his finger at each of these people in judgment. Well, it's been thousands of years, brethren and sisters, since this prophecy of Zephaniah. And after all that time, each one of these groups still exist. They can all be found in our day. And God is pointing the finger at each of these groups and is saying there's a time coming very soon when they're all going to be gone. And it's going to happen when his Son returns. And so most importantly for us is to heed that warning of Zephaniah, to not become complacent in our walk toward the kingdom. We need to continue to seek Yahweh diligently. In verses 7 to 13, Zephaniah gives a fairly detailed description of the impending day of Yahweh's judgment upon the nation of Judah. In verse 7, hold thy peace at the presence of Yahweh. For the day of Yahweh is at hand, for Yahweh has prepared a sacrifice. He has bid his guests. You know, we're really reaching a crescendo here at this point. Yahweh is saying, hold thy peace. Rotherham renders that in one word, hush. Hush, be quiet. It's like a parent turning to their child and saying, hush, be quiet, and listen to what I'm about to tell you. And this is what he tells them in verse 7. 2 points. Firstly, he's prepared a sacrifice. The word sacrifice is the Hebrew word zabak, and it means a slaughter. And the nation was going to be the sacrifice. God was going to put them to death as a punishment for sin. Everyone except those who he had hidden in Zephaniah 2 and verse 3. You see, the ultimate goal of Yahweh wasn't to destroy the nation, but the sacrifice was a necessity. If God hadn't intervened, imagine how things would have just continued. Isaiah 26 and verse 9 says, when thy judgments are on the earth, the inhabitants of the earth will learn righteousness. He's also bid his guests, and the word bid is the word sanctified or prepared. And the word guests is invited or called out ones. And here Zephaniah is talking about the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. They were going to act as the priest who would slay the Judah sacrifice. You know, in Jeremiah 27 and verse 6, it says that Nebuchadnezzar was God's servant. It reads, and now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And it's not the only time that God has sanctified and invited another nation to do his work. He also did the same thing with the Medes. They were going to be the sanctified ones against Babylon in Isaiah 13 and verse 3. So Judah is the sacrifice, and Nebuchadnezzar would be the sacrificial instrument used by God. And verses 8 to 9 show that every class of person would be sacrificed. Your status or your wealth or position couldn't save you in this case. Zephaniah starts at the top and he points at the nobles and the king's sons, those that had a position of responsibility. And we know from the record that Josiah's sons didn't live up to his example, and the nation continued to decline under their leadership. It's quite significant, of course, that Josiah isn't mentioned here, which just goes to prove that the work of the Reformations weren't simply lip service, but he genuinely was trying to turn the people back to God. He also points to those in verse 8 that wore strange apparel, It's the Hebrew word nokri, and it means a foreign or a non-relative or an adulterous or an outlandish garment. You see, these people were meant to wear the fringe of blue. That was what their calling had in the days of Moses. But they wanted to be like the nation, and so that the general population, the people, had changed their garments and they wore whatever the nations around them wore. It was probably extremely rare to see anyone with that blue fringe. Romans 12 and verse 2 puts it into context in our day. The apostle tells us, "And be not fashioned according to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, and ye may prove what is a good and acceptable and perfect will of God." And Zephaniah also points at the masters and the servants in verse 9. Here we have mentioned the people that leap over the threshold. And it's the same people that are filling their masters' houses with violence and deceit. You see, theft and plunder was rife in those days. And so you have these servants that have been sent by their masters to leap over the threshold into someone's house and pillage the household and do it violently. And the servants are being warned here, and they're being told, you just can't put your hands up and say, well, it's not my fault. My master told me to do this. I'm just doing what my master says. God is saying both the master and the servant are equally responsible for this evil practice of leaping over the threshold and taking the household's goods by force. And so Zephaniah, again, is pointing his finger at each of the different classes of people, the nobles, the king's children, the people in general with the strange apparel, the masters and the servants. Not one class of person would be exempted from this sacrifice, except for those that would be hidden in chapter 2 and verse 3. And think about this again in our day. The coming judgment upon the earth will cover the same cross-section of people. The nobles, the royal, the general population, the rich and the poor. Every single different class of person will feel the effects of the coming judgment. And it's only that small group. It's those called out ones, the group which each one of us has an opportunity to be a part of, who will be hidden in the day of Yahweh. And what Zephaniah describes next from verse 10 is so graphic, it wouldn't surprise me if he had actually seen this in vision. And what Zephaniah sees is he sees the Babylonian army coming down from the north. And as they arrive at the fish gate, which is the northern part of the city, they would have laid siege on that city. So the fish gate was the first place to raise the alarm in the event of an attack. And as the army enters into the city and continues down into the city, they make their way to a city which is intersected by the Christadelphian Valley, and it's made up of an upper and a lower city. And so here we have the second part of the city, that lower city. That part of the city is becoming panicked, and they're starting to howl in verse 10. And now the whole city is on high alert. The Babylonian army is swarming into the city. There's screams of terror. There's the sound of battle. And the panic, it's reverberating through the whole city and beyond the walls, even out to the hills. And in verse 11, the Babylonian army is making their way to the lower part of the city. The word Maktesh in verse 11 signifies depression, and it's rendered by Rotherham as the lower city. And it's probably this area of significant commercial trade. And you've got the merchants, they're all down there, and they're all trying to fill their pockets with their silver so that they can escape from the army. And the army is coming along and slaughtering them and taking the spoil for themselves. Look at what Yahweh says in verses 12 and 13. He's going to search out Jerusalem with candles. He's going to search out and punish those who are settled on their lees. The words here, it's the dregs of society. It's those people that didn't really believe that God would do anything good and evil, or evil. These people had dismissed the prophecies and thought that everything they did was simply hid from God. And so these people thought they would be safe in the dark, that their ways were concealed, and that Yahweh doesn't really even care because he's forsaken the earth. But God is making it clear in this prophecy of Zephaniah that you can't hide from God, that he's going to search each of them out using a lamp that you can't hide in the dark. If you get an opportunity through the week, I really encourage you to have a read of Ezekiel 9. It's a really graphic vision of this whole thing that's going on here. And you get this vision in Ezekiel 9 of Yahweh calling out in the day of judgment. He calls out with a loud voice for someone to action his judgments. And 6 men from the north with the weapons of slaughter come down. One of these men is wearing linen and he's got on his side an inkhorn. Just a little thing that you write with ink in it. And this one man's job was to go throughout all of the city, to search it out, perhaps with a lamp, and to find all of the faithful brethren and sisters. To find all the people that were crying out to God because of the abominations that had been taking place and that had cried and sighed for something to be intervened. And so this man with the inkhorn, he's looking out, he's searching out faithful brethren and sisters, and when he finds one, mark on the forehead. He finds another, mark on the forehead. These were the hidden ones that God was going to keep safe. And then behind him comes the other 5 with the weapons of slaughter. They've probably got lamps as well, and they're searching out the city. And their job is to go through the city and to smite. Don't have any pity. Don't spare the old or the young, male or female. Start with the elders and keep going until the job is done. But God warns them in Ezekiel 9. He says, don't you dare touch anyone that is marked with the inkhorn, because I'm protecting those people. And so it's no wonder then when you have that vision of what's going on here that Zephaniah in this final section and in verse 14 has this sense of urgency. And he talks about this day of Yahweh as a day of terror and alarm. Verse 14, it's repeated 3 times. The day of Yahweh is near. It's near. It hasteth greatly. It's being emphasized by Zephaniah. He's saying over and over, it's near. It's near. It's speeding along. Just like the day of Yahweh is for us. And verses 15 and 16, you've got that whole day described. It's a day of wrath. It's Yahweh's wrath. It's a day of trouble and distress. That's the people's reaction to the outpouring of God's wrath. It's a day of wasteness and desolation. Similar language used in Genesis 1 and verse 2 to describe an earth without form and void. It's a day of darkness and gloominess. It's as Micah prophesied in chapter 3 and verse 6, the sun shall go down over the prophets, and the day shall be dark over them. It's a day of thick cloud and thick darkness. It's a day of trumpet and alarm, as the sounds of battle rage around the city. And amidst this battle is raging, you've got this man dressed in linen with the inkhorn. He's searching out and he's marking the faithful as the army of Babylon sweeps through the city, bringing death and destruction. In verses 17 and 18, you've got the result described by Zephaniah in these closing verses. It's a people in distress. They're walking around like blind men. As the day of Yahweh is raging on around them, nothing is going to help them. Not their silver, not their gold, not their hidden places, not their own strength. Nothing would save them in that day. Only those who Yahweh had hidden would be saved. Well, the Bible attests to the fact that these events took place exactly as the Bible described. The nation was carried away captive by Nebuchadnezzar and the nation of Babylon. And we have these various chronicles that still exist today where Nebuchadnezzar describes some of these things. Jeremiah 39 describes the whole event after the fact. He describes how Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city of Jerusalem in the 9th year and the 10th month of Zedekiah, that the city was broken up 18 months later, that Zedekiah tried to escape, but he was caught. His sons were executed. The nobles were slain. The king's eyes were put out. The king's house was burned. The houses of the people were burned. The walls were destroyed. And the remnant were taken away into Babylon, with only the very poor being left in the land of Judah. So the day of the Lord came as prophesied. That phrase, day of the Lord, is found about 30 times in the Bible. And here in Zephaniah, he uses this phrase the most, 7 times in total. So for such a small book, it's got a real heavy emphasis on this day of the Lord. And we know there's another day of the Lord coming, and it's not too far away. It's that day which is mentioned in Acts 17 in verse 30 to 31, where God commands all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness. And we have that exact same level of urgency as well. The Bible finishes in Revelation saying, "Behold, I come quickly." And this day of the Lord, the one that we're anticipating, is described and explained in 2 Peter chapter 3. So let's just turn there in conclusion, just to have a look at a couple of these points as we close the night. 2 Peter chapter 3. Second Peter chapter 3, and in verse 10 we're told that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. So the political powers are all going to pass away with a great noise, just like the noise that would have been heard in the city of Jerusalem. It's all going to melt away and it's going to be burned up. And Peter says, well, if the day of the Lord is coming, in verse 11 he asks us a very simple question. He says in verse 11, if these things are happening, then what manner of person ought ye to be? It's a legitimate question. If the day of the Lord is coming, what manner of person ought we to be? Well, the apostle doesn't leave us hanging because he gives us the answer. He says, firstly, in verse 12, this is the type of person we need to be, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God. So we've got to be looking for it. We've got to be hasting. We've got to have our minds continually on this idea that Yahweh is going to send his Son to the earth. We need to look for it. And he repeats it again in verse 13. We need to look for a new heaven and a new earth. And look at how he concludes this question in verse 14. He says, if we're looking for this, and this is something we really want, then be diligent that ye may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless. Isn't that interesting that it's got the word diligent there? And we know from what we saw with Zephaniah is that one of the problems were this group of Christadelphians not being diligent. The Apostle Peter tells us we need to be diligent. You see, if we're diligent, the Apostle Peter tells us that we will be found of him. That man with the inkhorn, when he goes throughout the earth and is searching out the faithful brethren and sisters, he's going to find us. He's going to find someone who is in peace, who is without spot and blameless. That's who he's looking for. And he's going to mark them. Their name is going to be marked in the book of life. So may it be that each and every one of us will look to that day, will seek out Yahweh diligently, so that we might be amongst those that are marked by the man with the inkhorn and hidden of Yahweh in his great day of judgment.
BibleTruthandProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthandProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthandProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.